Hello and welcome to this short video on developmental editing. My name is Ernst and I'm a former political science professor and now I'm a developmental editor for academics as well as a consultant and coach. So just a brief overview of what I want to talk about in this short video. First of all, what is developmental editing? A lot of people don't know about it. I didn't know about it until about 5 years ago when I found out that I needed a developmental editor. What kind of projects are appropriate for a developmental editor, the different stages or scenarios in which you would hire a developmental editor, then a little bit about how you work together with a developmental editor, and then a brief note about funding at the end. So there's no one universally accepted definition of a developmental editor. One of the ways that we often talk about it is in reference to other kinds of editors who you might be more familiar with. For example, proofreaders tend to look at for typos, right? They're the final sort of line of defense, if you will, and making sure that everything looks right when you send out your manuscript. Then there are line editors, oftentimes then copy editors, but we'll just, for the purposes of this, talk about them as line editors. And what they do is they go through line by line and make sure that everything flows, is grammatically correct. They also look for things like conciseness and making sure that your meaning is understood. So developmental editors are kind of at the highest level in terms of the manuscript, right? So they're looking at the overarching issues that might come up in a manuscript, particularly those, imagine that, of course, many of you are peer reviewers for a journal. So the kind of issues that you would look for in a peer-reviewed journal article. So things such as, does the argument make sense? Is evidence persuasive, or whatever it is that we're using as evidence, right? Does everything flow together? Are there things missing? Are there things, that could be left out? Et cetera, right? So these are sort of very high-level issues for your manuscript. And then it gets down into the weeds a little bit, particularly, if we're looking at your argument, maybe you have a thesis statement, and so we're looking specifically at that sentence, but we're not looking necessarily at the sentence level the whole time in terms of what you would look for as a line editor, which is flow and grammar. Of course, we may make suggestions about that, but really, you hire a developmental editor at the very beginning of your project, whereas line editors and proofreaders you hire much later on once you're very satisfied with the overarching structure of your piece. I also included this quote about developmental editing because I think it's very appropriate in understanding the spirit in which developmental editors work, including myself. So successful collaboration allows the author to feel sustained and liberated by knowing that she doesn't have to bear the burden of creation, development, and refinement alone. Excuse me. So I highlighted sustained and liberated because oftentimes for developmental editors and scholar-client, the relationship unfolds over the course of many years. For myself, my developmental editor, who's Kim Greenwell, who's fantastic, I've been working with her probably at least 3 years now on my book manuscript because it's gone through so many different iterations and gone to the press and had reviewers and so forth. And so I keep coming back to her because she's familiar with the project. She understands what my goals are. And then she'll go back and help me figure out, okay, this is how we can address the reviewers' comments, right? So it's liberating because you're not alone. And, even if you work in a discipline in which collaboration is a norm, this is a different kind of collaboration because you're actually, this person's sole sort of focus when looking at your paper is to make sure that you are the one who's getting this published and that your voice is retained in the process. Collaborators, they run the range of different sort of types of collaboration, and they're also interested in the article, but developmental editors are specifically focused on use in the article itself. And so this is, again, this is liberating because academic writing can be very isolating. And also, if you're writing a book manuscript, there are not many points along the way at which you receive feedback. You may present a conference paper, you may have a colleague read one chapter, but they're not going to, most colleagues are not going to have the time to read your entire manuscript multiple times, right, and give you really detailed high-level feedback. So this is very helpful in terms of thinking about why you would hire a developmental editor. Okay, so the kinds of projects that you would hire a developmental editor services for. Obviously, I've already talked about books and articles. Dissertations are great, especially if you're stuck and maybe your chair committee just doesn't have the time to help you with your manuscript and you just don't know where to go. The one caveat with dissertations is that we do want to make sure that your chair and committee knows that you're hiring a developmental editor and they're okay with that. And also we check university policies to make sure that there aren't any guidelines around this. Because you can imagine essentially, you having someone step in and helping a student, and you want to make sure that everyone's clear that you're not writing the dissertation for them. Another area is fellowship applications. This can be really helpful area to hire a developmental editor because even if you've written many fellowship applications, oftentimes there are specific guidelines that you've just never come across before, and so you want to make sure that you are hitting all the specific guidelines and that everything is tight and makes sense. Tenure files are another area. People don't really think about hiring a developmental editor for. And it's kind of ironic because these are the most important documents of your career if you're on the tenure track, right? Your tenure and or your promotion if you're going to full professor. So I offer a service where I combine a line edit with a developmental edit for these documents because they really need a kind of level of attention that like a journal article just doesn't need. And also there's a lot of nuance that we want to make sure we hit all the main points and don't have any, like, for example, alarming words or phrases that are in there. And then also, because I was chair of the department, I'm very familiar, and I was on rank and tenure, I'm familiar with whether or not, for example, a lot of times I find that scholars will put things in a service category that actually do belong in scholarship, and we know that because scholarship is weighted more than service, we want to make sure that it's in the right category and that you get credit for it. So I can make suggestions like that. Another area is your book prospectus. So this can be really helpful because even if you've written multiple books, we still, as academics, generally don't write a ton of books. And so in between, we can forget how to write a prospectus, what should be in there, what's missing. And it's a particular genre that we don't write in very often. And so it can help you look at, for example, the rationale, which is very different than writing an abstract, right? We can also look at the audience, right? And make sure that, you have nailed the audience for this particular press. And then finally, I have on here independent publishing. This isn't strictly a developmental editor's job in any way, but I have a lot of experience with independent publishing, fiction and nonfiction. And so if you wanted to go down that route, essentially this is kind of almost a consultant role where you would talk to me, and potentially I can help you too if you want some guidance in how to actually go about independently publishing. It's so much easier than you might think it is, and so can kind of just demystify some of that for you. And if you're wondering, well, what would I, consider, what would I publish independently? I'm not going to publish my academic book. Well, that's correct. You're not, because you need to get it with the press. However, if you have specialized knowledge, which we all have, that the general world needs to know about, for example, if you're an education professor and you've written up a curriculum, let's say an anti-racist curriculum, right? And you want to get that out as far and wide as you can, an academic press is not going to do that for you. So independent publishing means that you can then distribute it through libraries, bookstores, right? You can have hardback versions of this, you can have ebook versions, and hopefully you can make a little money off of it as well. All right, so the 4 scenarios in which you might hire a developmental editor. These are just, the most common ones. There are probably others as well, but these are the ones I run across the most. Beginning a project, I'm going to go through each of them. Stuck in the soggy middle, completed but not ready for review, and revise and resubmit. Okay. Beginning a project is actually an area where I don't see a lot of people contacting a developmental editor. And I think there are probably a couple of reasons for that beyond just people not knowing about developmental editing. And that is when we start a project, particularly a book project, we're really excited about it and we have usually we think we have a pretty clear direction in which we want to go. So we just dive right in and we start writing. And this is great. If you know exactly where you're going, then just keep on going. The tricky part is that sometimes you dive in too soon, you don't really have a plan, and then you get stuck, as I'm going to talk about in just a second. So this can be a great opportunity to just talk through with someone, and say you have a detailed outline and maybe the first chapter, and you have a couple of different directions you could go in. You can talk to the developmental editor, they can read it over, and you can figure out what's the best way to go so that you can sustain yourself throughout the whole project. Another area that's related is feedback on a book prospectus draft. So the very beginning stages of a project, maybe you want to write a book prospectus for your book. That can be a great exercise to make sure that you're clear on where you need to go, and then you can hand it to the developmental editor, and that's a great way for us to have a discussion about what your options might be in moving forward. All right, stuck in the soggy middle. So this is, particularly if you're writing a book, this is normal. You get in, 3 chapters and you just run out of steam. And it could be you're just tired and you just need to put it aside for a little while. It also could be that you just, you dived in and you didn't really have a plan, and now you've kind of, come to a halt because you're not sure where to go. Or maybe you are clear on where to go, but there's 2 options, right, of where you could go. And you really don't want to waste all your time writing the next 3 chapters and finding out that this isn't going to work, right, that you've essentially written 2 books. So what we could do is read the first 3 chapters and give you some feedback about that, and especially if you have an idea of where you want to go next. The other area where you might have some issues is you finished a first draft, and congratulations on finishing the first draft. You read it over and you're just not sure that, for example, your argument makes any sense, or maybe you think, I actually have 2 arguments here and they're not exactly aligned with each other, but you're not really sure, and so you need a second pair of eyes to tell you whether or not there's a particular issue. That's a fairy in the background. So what we can do is help you assess it, because of course, this is why you need editors, is that you're just too close to the project itself. You are no longer able to make any determinations about whether or not it actually makes sense. Okay, the third area is completed but not ready for review. So similarly, let's say this is beyond the first draft, you've done the revisions, and you're ready to send it out, and you just want to make sure, it's in the best condition possible. For example, if this is, maybe 2 years before tenure, right? You go up for tenure, and you need, your chair has said, your publications are great, but you really need one in this top journal, right? In that scenario, you don't have time to submit it to them and then have it be rejected. You need to get that accepted now. So you want to make sure that everything is just in the right place, right? So this is different than maybe you have this manuscript and you just want to submit it somewhere, right? This is when the stakes are really high. Another area is perhaps you have 4 or 5 different journals and you just don't know which one would be the most appropriate for your article. And for a lot of people I work with, and this includes myself, we're interdisciplinary scholars, so oftentimes there's just so many options for us to choose from, and we just don't even know which one we should submit to. So we can help you sort through that. And then the final area is one that is not thought of very often and can go into the line editing phase. That is that you've written, for example, let's say a 10,000 word article, and the journal says no more than 8,000 words. And you've tried everything and you can't cut it down to 8,000 words. So you can give it to the developmental editor and say, I have really concise writing, but I'm just not sure. Maybe there are parts of this article that I can just cut, but I'm so close to it, I just can't tell. So we can go through and say, yeah, paragraph 2 on page 4, that can really, consider deleting that or folding it into the previous paragraph and just writing a sentence about it. Similarly, in the line editing kind of phase of this, if you're a wordy writer, I'm a very wordy writer, and so I need to go through multiple drafts to get my prose down to a concise version that is publishable. What we can do is essentially go through on a line edit and just remove all the extra words, and that may be enough to get you to the word count. Or we could do a combination of the two. You get the general idea. All right. The last area, and one of the most, I think, important in terms of thinking about working with a developmental editor, is revise and resubmit. So we've all had, well, hopefully not all of us, have had very harsh criticism on our articles from anonymous reviewers. This is unfortunately a fact of academic life, and I've seen it prevent people from publishing, which really breaks my heart because they just don't want to get that rejection letter. So let's say you receive the letter back and you start to look at it and you realize, oh, this person is really going on a rant, and I just don't think I have the stomach to read this. You can give it to a developmental editor, and what we can do is read it for you and then go through and repackage what it is they're saying into actually helpful and constructive language. And then you can decide whether or not you want to go forward with a revise and resubmit. But it really takes out the sting of the rejection, which is hard to overcome. And then it also means that someone else is looking at it with you, so you're not alone. Okay? And we can give you some honest feedback about, whether or not, for example, it has nothing to do with the quality of your article, but it just looks like it's kind of hopeless, and we're not really sure if you want to spend the time to actually make all these revisions. Maybe you'd be better off just submitting it elsewhere. Another area of revise and resubmit is that you have decided to revise, but you don't know how to go about it. So you have vague, maybe the feedback is encouraging, but it's vague. And so you need someone to go through and pull out specific tasks for you to then go into the article and make those revisions, okay? And this is where we can get pretty granular if you need us to, and say, like on page 2, insert a new paragraph here. Number 3, you made the changes, but you want to make sure they match up with the comments, right? So maybe you've been working on this and there were major revisions suggested, and you're no longer able to tell whether or not you actually made the suggestions they made. I mean, I encourage you to obviously track those so that you don't run into that scenario, but sometimes you just completely overhauled the entire article, and so you just need to make sure that you are addressing them. Similarly, in writing the response memo, which is a very important part of the revise and resubmit process, and I have a template for the response memos on my website that you can download if you want. You want to make sure that you're adequately addressing the reviewer comments, right? And so you need to write a detailed response memo that goes line by line, where, not line by line of the article, but all of the specific suggestions that were made, and say how you address them. And sometimes you can say, I didn't address it. As long as you have a reason for why you didn't address it, then usually it's fine. But you do need to say whether you did or you didn't address it. And this can be a really helpful area to have feedback, because we can help you strategize around, particularly if there's a suggestion being made that you really strongly disagree with, then we can figure out, well, can you make all the other changes and then push back on this particular area, especially if it's just one reviewer who's making that comment. Okay, how we work together. So oftentimes your relationship with a developmental editor will be over the long term. That's really the best case scenario. You'll check in and out with them on various projects, particularly if you're working on a book manuscript. I've been working with my developmental editor for over 3 years, and that's through all the various phases. So what we do is we provide a high-level memo. Sometimes it will do track changes, but most of the time it's a high-level memo that goes through all the various areas, for example, of your article, and where we see some improvements could be made, or we have questions. So, for example, we might have a section titled Argument. and we go through and say, you could tighten this up here, you could drop this out, and then also, provide actual suggestions, substantive suggestions about how you might move forward. So it is not down in the weeds in the sense of a line editor going through and changing words, but we are very specific about where these issues are located in the manuscript. So typically I like to set up, if this is a fairly large project that is not very straightforward, I like to set up a time to talk, maybe for about 30 minutes before I give you the memo. And the reason for that is that there are oftentimes a few major outstanding issues that I want to discuss with you before I write up the memo, because I can get a little bit more clarity from you about what direction you might want to go in. So for example, if I say, your argument has these two strands and they seem to be competing with each other, which one do you think is more important, right? And you say, well, argument A is more important. Then after the call, what I can do is go back and revise the memo and say, focus on argument A, so that the memo is more useful for you. So I send you the memo and the manuscript back, and then you can email me if you have any questions, of course. The last thing I'll say about working with any editor, but particularly developmental editors, is that you really need to plan ahead. We're trying to juggle multiple projects. Most of us are freelancers, and so we can't necessarily, we're trying to keep our calendars full, but not too full. So if you email us and say, I need this book manuscript turned around in a week, we're going to say no. And even if we had the time, even if we didn't have any work that week, we still say no. And the reason is that editors can typically, from what I've seen other people say, can really focus on average 3 to 4 hours a day maximum for editing tasks. That's actually timed, Pomodoro, 25-minute sprints at a time. And the reason for this is it's extremely taxing on the brain. It's a little different than writing, but it's very similar in terms of, the analytical skills that are required. So that means that, we can't edit your manuscript for 8 hours a day. We're doing other things related to the business during those other hours. So even if we wanted to, it would be irresponsible of us to say that we could do it in that amount of time, because we really wouldn't be giving it the focus and the attention that it deserves. So the main thing is just plan ahead as much as you can. Get on our calendar, because you may be surprised at, you think you're working ahead, but actually you're not, right? We've already been booked for the next month. So you really need to talk to us as soon as you can, even if you're not exactly sure when you'll be finished. At least if you can give us a basic estimate, that's fine, because we're used to people not finishing things on time. I'm an academic editor myself, so I know how hard it is to actually accurately estimate how long a project is going to take for a variety of reasons. And so we're used to that, but the main thing is you just need to keep us in the loop and let us know what's going on. Finally, funding. Yes. So I just want to emphasize that this is your academic career, and scholarly publishing for most academics, unless you are at the community college level, for example, is the most important part of your portfolio. And so getting support for that is really important, right? And I didn't hire a developmental editor earlier in my career, not because I didn't want to, I just didn't know they existed. Once I figured out they existed, then I got really creative about asking my university for funding. And so what I've done is I've written an article that's published on Medium and LinkedIn and on my website. You can find it. I think it's called 5 Ways to Find Academic Funding for Editing. And I've detailed the different ways that I've gone about finding funding, or others have gone about finding funding that have been successful. And there are things that you might not have thought of. So I encourage you to check that out. And if you have any questions, please email me. My email is on the website, and I look forward to hearing from you. Bye.